Now let's look at Tonkens' reply. We looked at Arkin, who's trying to make a case for autonomous and lethal robots in warfare, and thinks in the end it's going to be more, not perfect, of course, but a more ethical activity than it would be if humans are involved. And Tonkin wants to say, yeah, I don't think so. So hence the case against robotic warfare. This is his response to Arkin. Now, he says that a key thing that's running in the background, right, software in the background image of Arkin is this presupposition of inevitability. And that in that, the autonomous warfare it's coming, says Arkin. Well, it's not surprising. Arkin is a roboticist, so there is a little bit of a vested interest of, if that's your trade, you're not surprised that it'd be odd if he said it's not the future. So people who, as Tonkin says, if you're in that trade of robotics, it's not hard to believe that you're going to say, well, robotics, that's the future. And so, it's just inevitable that robots are coming. They're going to be more and more automated, and that automated warfare, it's inevitable. You can't stop it. Now, these kinds of arguments are often made. The counter argument is to go into history and find some technological advance that was stopped. You can do that. And many authors have done that. So it's not the case that technology always just advances. That there have been examples in the history of warfare where something that was introduced, some technological advancement, was eventually banned or pulled back or just eliminated. It's not nearly as common as perhaps one might like, because when humans devise better ways to kill each other, they tend to go with it. But nonetheless, it is certainly not logically the case that if the technology is there, that absolutely humans are going to use it. So this inevitability, he says, is not he says that is the presupposition of Arkin. Tonkens says it's not self-evident. It really has to be argued for. And of course, if we talk about robotic warfare as being inevitable, we just fuel the inevitability argument because we're stating the conclusion all the time, and we're just sort of drilling it in that well, if you're just hearing it's inevitable, then it almost becomes that's a description and not the conclusion of something that needs to be argued for. It's not self-evident. Okay. So in the end, the inevitability hypothesis is just that. It's an assumption. It's not necessarily a given. And Tonkens rejects this inevitability presupposition. He also rejects as the reasons. Remember in the previous video, we did the 6 reasons that Arkin gives for, for why it would be okay and why to have these lethal robots on the battlefield. Tonkens goes through that, so you can have a look at those, and he goes through them, more or less line by line, and says, for instance, so he rejects the 6 reasons. Consider Arkin's reason 2, which was better sensors, ultimately more ethical. I talked about that in that cluster of predicates model. Tonkens just says, look, this isn't really unethical. It's just a technical point. So what if computers maybe are better? And, it's making a similar point to what I made earlier, is just because they're better at assimilating data doesn't necessarily follow that they're going to make better ethical decisions. And so in that sense, he says that a lot of what Arkin presents as ethical reasons are really just technological statements, and they're not necessarily ethical. It's not ethical reasoning. So, but that's also a key point to keep in mind when you read these kinds of essays. Is very often one category of statement will be made and then described as supporting a whole other category. So a technical statement isn't necessarily easily translatable, but you can call it an ethical statement, but calling it doesn't necessarily make it so. Now, so we can look at a little bit more, Arkin would probably respond with something that, we talked about in the earlier video, that, wow, with more data, you're going to make better ethical decisions. It's not going to be perfect, but it's looking that the more, because computers are better at integrating and assimilating and gathering and all that stuff about data, then there's a good chance they'll they'll make better ethical decisions. So this one is a contentious point. Is it just strictly a technical statement, or does it sort of shade off into an ethical one? That's the sort of the main difference here. So you can have a look at Tonkens. He goes through all of the 6 reasons and tries to chip away at all of them. In a nutshell, though, he thinks all of them are wanting. And much of Tonkens' argument, not all of it, but a lot of it, seems to center on the overstatement of shall we say, that Arkin makes of his position, namely that that Tonkens seems to say something like that Arkin exaggerates the level of atrocities. Yes, they are committed, but in terms of the vast majority of soldiers, it's not the case that they're all out there committing atrocities. And so it's an exaggeration. Maybe the problem of atrocities on the battlefield is, and that we need, ethical robots. They won't commit these atrocities. That could be an exaggeration of the problem. Something like, humans commit atrocities X on the battlefield. Robots are less likely to do that on the battlefield. So then robots are more moral soldiers than humans are. Well, in one sense, that might be valid. You have to argue out how to interpret all of these terms, about committing on the battlefield and less likely. And, so you might have a kind of valid argument in this sense. But, in logic, and when we argue, we're not necessarily just worried about validity. I mean, the logicians are worried about that first and foremost, as we should be. But many of our arguments are they're not necessarily valid, but they can still be good arguments. But even if we say, just for the sake of discussion, that yeah, this is actually logically pretty good, and it's valid, so maybe the conclusion does actually follow from the premises, you could still say something like this. Well, I'm not sure if this is actually true, or in the sense of an overstatement, because it just says, if you really think about this, humans, it's just basically saying that humans are doing this all the time. And that's what Tonkens is saying, that Arkin is really pushing this line that humans are just contributing so much to, atrocities and all that. And that this may be not necessarily a sound argument. So even if it's valid, it's not sound. Now, if you get that, then you just have a valid argument, which is just basically a structure of sentences that bear certain relationships to each other. But you can't run and say the conclusion of that necessarily applies to the real world, because, valid arguments can have all kinds of premises and conclusions, and they may not relate to the real world at all. So if it's not sound, that is. So if it's valid and not sound, doesn't mean it's a good argument. So perhaps it's exaggerated that humans, are committing all these atrocities. What if it's the case that human beings, all things considered, when you look at the number of atrocities versus the number of humans on battlefields and all these interactions, maybe they might be, in terms of when they're committed, they get a lot of attention because they are, by definition, they're atrocities. So they're going to get a lot of attention. But it might be a situation where you say, but given all of it, they don't happen that often as compared to the number of interactions on the battlefield. All right, so if that's the case, then the case for, if it's not that often, then the case for robots on the battlefield is weakened, in that it's not that absolutely pressing, and this is to say that again, if Arkin is pushing the point that robots are desperately needed, why? Because it's a desperate problem, so that gives rise to a desperate need. It becomes almost like a kind of sales pitch, right? Where it's like, oh, you got a real problem here, and I've got the solution for it. And so my solution, you need it now. Like, you need it yesterday. It's so severe, your problem. But your problem may not be that severe. So do you absolutely need this? Could you look at other solutions? You don't necessarily have to buy this one, and you certainly don't have to buy it right away. So Tonkens is saying that, if you exaggerate the case of atrocities, then you kind of bolster the case for the robots. But what if the atrocities are exaggerated? Okay, so it's and even if the atrocities are bad, it still could be the case that atrocities will be committed by robots as well, and certainly a lot of people fear that, and Tonkens is saying it's not a totally wild fear that things can go wrong with technology too. So the atrocities may not occur in the exact same way, but they could. You can't say for sure that they won't occur at all. Now, the last, so that's a rough summary of Tolkien's response. And Tonkin says that a paradox kind of emerges. I'm not sure paradox is the right word, but in any case, a couple of ways that automated warfare can emerge. So just I've summarized these very briefly here. Where it's for number one is mostly human, so it's predominantly human warfare, minimum use of automation. That's not terribly exciting. That's standard war stuff. The second one is kind of part and part, part human, part machine, and that one is involves a substantial use of autonomous and semi-autonomous lethal robotic systems by humans. That seems problematic, and for more or less the problematic reasons that are standardly stated is that this sort of conjunction of semi-autonomous weapons and autonomous human beings leads to the autonomous part becoming totally disconnected and arguably kind of amoral when it comes to the warfare. Hence the old example of the drone operator that becomes like war becomes a video game to her or him. There's that problem. But then the last one is if we look at fully autonomous, fully automated, that is humanless warfare, this is going to be, as we've seen, this could be the worst one. If it's fully automated, you kind of get an eternal warfare problem on this one. Why is that? Well, it's arguably a kind of science fiction scenario, but it will go something like this. If you could eliminate human death from warfare, and then war becomes simply a battle between machines, right? It becomes kind of like, like sort of a smash-up derby of cars, in which is the last car driving is the winner. Now, and all the other drivers are not killed. They're just, the cars are immobilized, but nobody's killed. But there is a winner in the battle of the machines. Now imagine that the drivers are all sitting in the stands and they're just doing remote control. And then imagine that nobody's even driving the cars or remotely or whatever, that we just sit back and one side sits on one side of the stadium and the other side sits in the other, and we just watch the cars smash each other up, and the last car driving around, that side wins. It's not a guarantee that, given what humans are, that people would accept this, right? That the side that lost might not accept it. There's no guarantee that the losing side of the humans on the losing side of the mechanized battle might say, well, you may have defeated our machines, but you still haven't defeated us. And then plain old good old fashioned warfare could break out. And so the problem of, trying to eliminate all the ethical issues involved in war would just lead to those ethical issues again. You wouldn't eliminate them, you just postpone them. Or, on the other hand, it may be the case that you could generate such an industry of war that it would just be perpetual. It would just be constantly rebuilt. Like maybe the machines could be built and sent out to use the analogy of the spectators, right? The human spectators just watching the cars smash each other up. Well, maybe the factories on both sides could be just pumping the cars out, and it would be an eternal smash-up derby. That nobody would ever win. It would just, the economies and everything would just be pumping out these cars for the smash-up derby, and the war would become eternal. And that problem, now that's been exposed, that's been treated at length in science fiction novels about the mechanization of war will eventually lead to the perpetuity of it. It immortalizes it because, in one sense, there isn't really a condition of losing anymore. It's just always just replacement and replacement and replacement. So the paradox would be that you ultimately may get rid of certain ethical problems, but you'll generate the notion of eternal war. And so in the end, Tonkens says, well, look, Arkin's made some points. But he's also got some heavy-duty presuppositions. And in the end, what he could be doing, if his plan goes through, is getting us into a situation of eternal war.